The restaurant smelled like garlic and old money. Fiora Esposito had worked the dinner shift at Trattoria Rossetti for 3 years, long enough to know the difference between the men who came to eat and the men who came to conduct business over plates of ossobuco they would barely touch. The distinction was subtle, a certain stillness in the shoulders, a way of positioning chairs so that backs faced walls, the way conversation dropped to registers below the ambient noise of a Thursday night, swallowed whole by the murmur of the kitchen and the low, sweet cry of a jazz trumpet bleeding from the speakers overhead. Tonight was different. She felt it before she saw it, a change in the atmospheric pressure of the room, the way other diners instinctively dropped their voices without knowing why, the way Marco, the maitre d', adjusted his tie 3 times in under a minute as he led the party of 4 to the private alcove at the back, the last table on the left, the one with the velvet curtain that was never, under any circumstance, fully drawn. Fiora balanced 2 plates of pappardelle on her forearm and delivered them to table 7 without looking up. She knew the room by its sounds, the clink of the Murano glass candle holders, the precise interval between courses that old Mr. Carlucci at table 3 required, the way the front door's draft moved the candle flames in a specific ripple that told her someone important had just entered. She set the plates down, smiled, recited the names of the dishes with the easy warmth she'd cultivated over years of keeping customers comfortable, and then turned. The man at the last table on the left was watching her. Not openly, not the way tourists watched her when they mistook her dark hair and Roman features for something decorative. This was the careful, measuring surveillance of a man who watched everything without appearing to watch anything. He had dark hair swept back from a face that would have been beautiful if beauty were the right word for it. It wasn't. The right word was precise, every feature arranged with an economy that suggested nature had been unusually efficient. Jaw set hard, eyes the color of smoke over dark water. He sat at the head of the table in the way that heads of tables were meant to be occupied, not by physical dominance, but by a gravitational certainty that pulled the geometry of the room toward him. Nero Falcone. She didn't know his name yet. That would come later. What she knew in that moment was that he was dangerous, and that the 3 men seated with him, 2 of whom she recognized as regulars who always tipped well and spoke in murmurs, were secondary to him in every measurable way. They didn't look at him when they spoke. They directed their words to the tablecloth, to their folded hands, to the middle distance, and waited. Fiora looked away. This was the other skill she'd cultivated over 3 years, the ability to unsee what she'd seen, to carry knowledge lightly, the way you'd carry a full glass across a crowded room, with perfect balance and no indication of effort. She took her station at the service bar and began preparing the table's first round without being asked. Water, still. A bottle of the Barolo that Marco had already placed on ice. Bread, olive oil, the small plate of olives that the regular customers, the men with the still shoulders, always ordered in the first 5 minutes. Last table, Marco said quietly, appearing beside her. I know. You know what I mean. I always know what you mean, Marco. He looked at her for a moment with that particular expression she'd learned to read, the one that mixed appreciation with something uncomfortably close to pity. Marco Ferretti had worked this restaurant for 20 years. He was a careful man. He had opinions about which tables required which waitstaff, and those opinions were based on calculations Fiora had never fully been invited to understand. Take the Garibaldi table, they're secondi, he said. I'll handle, I've already prepared the tray. Another pause. Fiora. I'm the best server in this room, Marco. You've said so yourself. I know how to be invisible. That wasn't quite true. She knew how to seem invisible. There was a difference. And on some level, standing with her hand on the tray and her back to the last table on the left, she suspected the man with the smoke-colored eyes already understood the distinction. She lifted the tray and walked. The alcove was recessed from the main floor by 2 steps and a half wall of carved dark wood, which meant that sound traveled in a particular way, outward from the table, gathered by the shallow bowl of the architecture, and directed toward the service path she walked every time she approached. She had learned this about the alcove in her second week at the restaurant, when she'd overheard a divorce negotiation so brutal it had kept her awake until 3 in the morning. She had learned then to not hear what she heard, to filter it, to let it wash over her like water over stone, leaving no mark. She set the water glasses, poured the Barolo with the slight theatrical tilt she'd practiced until it looked effortless, set down the olives, and heard, quite clearly, the man with the smoke-colored eyes say, in a voice calibrated to carry no further than the tablecloth, "The Marchetti shipment moves Friday. Anyone who isn't where they're supposed to be doesn't come home Saturday." The silence that followed was the particular kind that gathers around a statement of absolute certainty. Fiora lifted the empty tray, adjusted the breadbasket, let her eyes rest on the far wall, a faded fresco of the Amalfi Coast, fishing boats in blue and gold, with the vacant pleasantness of a woman whose mind was entirely occupied with the question of whether Table 9 needed more Parmesan. She turned to go. "Miss." His voice. She turned back, and there it was, the first time she looked directly at him, the first time she felt the full weight of his attention like a hand pressed flat between her shoulder blades. "The bread," he said. "It's cold." It wasn't cold. She'd taken it from the warmer 40 seconds ago. She looked at the basket, then at him, with the mild, professional expression of a woman who had heard this complaint before and knew what to do about it. "Of course," she said. "I'll bring you a fresh basket." She walked back to the service bar without hurrying, set the tray down without rattling it, stood for a moment with her hands flat on the cool marble surface, and let out one slow, controlled breath. Marco was watching her from across the room. She gave him the slight nod that meant everything was fine, and went to get the bread. She didn't think about it again until close. The party at the last table stayed until 11:15, long after the rest of the restaurant had emptied. She served their secondi, their dolci, the small glasses of limoncello that ended every serious meal. She was professional and pleasant and entirely unremarkable, which was the point, and at no time did the man with the smoke-colored eyes address her again. But he watched her. Not constantly, he was too composed for that, too practiced in the art of selective attention. But in the intervals between the business being conducted across that table, in the spaces between sentences, she felt his gaze return to her the way a compass needle returns to north. Involuntary, calibrated. She was stripping the linen from a vacated table near the window when they finally stood to leave. The 3 men with the still shoulders moved first, a coordinated dispersal that spoke of long habit. The man with the smoke-colored eyes was last. He buttoned the top button of his jacket, charcoal, beautifully cut, the kind that cost more than her monthly rent, and turned toward the door. He paused at the edge of the alcove and looked at her directly. Not the measuring surveillance of before. This was something else, a look with weight in it, with a question she wasn't sure she wanted to answer. It lasted 3 seconds, perhaps 4, long enough to mean something, short enough to deny. Then he left, and the restaurant exhaled, and Fiora went back to stripping the linen. "You did well," Marco said, later, handing her an envelope that was thicker than her usual tip share. She looked at it but didn't open it. "Who was he?" Marco was quiet for a moment. He was a man who chose his words the way other men chose their battles, carefully, with an awareness of what he was willing to lose. "His family owns this restaurant," Marco said. "Has owned it for 15 years. Fiora turned the envelope over in her hands. She thought about the bread that hadn't been cold, the test that hadn't been a complaint at all. "His name?" she asked. "Nero Falcone," Marco said. "And Fiora, what you heard tonight, whatever it was." "I didn't hear anything," she said. Marco studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and turned away. Outside, the Chicago wind had picked up. She could hear it against the restaurant's old glass windows, a low, persistent sound, like something trying to get in. She walked home the long way, through the orange-lit streets of the near North Side, and told herself that the slight quickening of her pulse was nothing more than the cold. She looked it up. She wasn't sure why she did it, or rather, she was entirely sure why she did it and chose not to examine the reason too closely. She sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment above the dry cleaner on Halsted Street, her laptop open, a glass of red wine she wasn't really drinking beside her hand, and she typed his name into the search bar. Nero Falcone. What came back was the controlled, careful portrait of a man who understood that information was power, in both its presence and its absence. A LinkedIn profile, sparse, corporate, listing him as the principal of Falcone Holdings, a real estate and hospitality group with properties across Chicago, Miami, and New York. A few photographs from charity galas, the lyric opera fundraiser, the children's memorial benefit, the kind of events that required the presence of a certain stratum of Chicago wealth and provided excellent cover for the kind of wealth that didn't announce itself in newspaper profiles. In the photographs, he wore the same expression he'd worn in the restaurant, composed, watchful, slightly removed from whatever was happening around him, as though the events of the visible world were occurring at a slight distance from wherever he actually lived. He was 34, she eventually gathered, unmarried, no children of public record. He had a brother, Luca, 2 years younger, who appeared in more photographs and smiled more easily in them, the public face of whatever private architecture the Falcone name supported. Their father, Enzo Falcone, had died 7 years ago. Their mother, Carmela, still lived in the house in Elmwood Park where the brothers had grown up, a fact mentioned in a neighborhood profile of the old Italian enclave that read, on second pass, like it had been written by someone who understood that certain kinds of facts provided a useful kind of normalcy. Fiora closed the laptop. She thought about what she knew of the Falcone name from 3 years of working in a restaurant that bore it. She thought about the Thursday night regulars with the still shoulders. She thought about the way Marco had given her an envelope instead of a conversation. She thought about the bread that wasn't cold. She finished her wine and went to bed and did not sleep well, and in the morning she got up and went to work the lunch shift and pretended, competently, that the previous night had been entirely unremarkable. He came back the following Thursday. The same table, the same 3 men, or 2 of the same and 1 new one, a younger man, dark-suited, with the careful blankness of someone who'd recently been promoted past his comfort zone. The same Barolo. The same order. Fiora was assigned to the table without discussion. Marco said nothing, she said nothing. The assignment was an answer to a question neither of them had asked aloud. This time she was prepared. Prepared, she had decided, meant the following. She would be exactly what she'd been the first time. Professional, efficient, invisible in the ways that mattered. She would not listen to what she heard. She would not try to hear what she wasn't meant to. She would bring the bread warm, pour the wine without theater, smile at the middle distance, and move through the space around that table the way light moved through a window. Present, but not intrusive, revealing only what was already there. What she had not prepared for was the way he watched her with something new in it. The surveillance was still there, precise, habitual, the practiced observation of a man who never fully turned off the part of himself that catalogued and assessed. But there was something underneath it now, something she recognized the way you recognize a piece of music you haven't heard in years, not through conscious recall, but through the body's older, less voluntary memory. He was curious about her. Not in the way that men at restaurant tables were sometimes curious. That was a different kind of attention, one she'd learned to deflect with the practiced ease of long experience. This was more specific, more considered. The curiosity of a man who had encountered something that didn't fit his existing categories and was deciding whether to create a new one. She poured the Barolo. He was speaking to the new man. Something about permits, the word infrastructure used twice in a way that clearly meant something other than infrastructure. And he didn't acknowledge her presence beyond the slight angle of his body that indicated awareness without engagement. She was withdrawing when he said, without turning, "You've been here 3 years." Not a question, a statement of confirmed fact. She paused. "Yes." "You studied at DePaul." Still not a question. "Comparative literature." She kept her expression neutral. The envelope on Tuesday night, she now understood, had not been generosity. It had been a transaction. Payment for a background check she hadn't consented to and couldn't object to. "I dropped out," she said, "in my 3rd year." "Why?" The table had gone very quiet. The 3 men were studying their menus, or the table, or the middle distance, wherever men looked when they were performing the task of not listening to their employer conduct an interview with a waitress in the middle of a Thursday dinner service. "My mother was ill," Fiora said. "It was necessary." Something moved across his face, too fast and too controlled for her to name. Is she better now? She died, 18 months ago. A pause. I'm sorry. The simplicity of it, the absence of the usual scaffolding of condolence, the platitudes and the gentle deflections people used to put distance between themselves and someone else's grief, caught her off guard. She looked at him directly, perhaps for longer than she should have. Thank you, she said. He held her gaze for one precise moment. Then he turned back to his dinner companions, and the conversation resumed, and Fiora walked back to the service bar and stood very still for a count of 10 before she trusted herself to pick anything up. After close that night, Marco found her restocking the bar. He asked about you, Marco said. Before he came tonight, he asked me what I knew about you. Fiora set down the bottle she was holding. What did you tell him? The truth, that you're the best person on my floor, that you're reliable and intelligent, and you know when to be quiet. Marco paused. He asked if you were involved with anyone. The kitchen sounds filtered through from the back, the last of the crew breaking down the line, the clatter of sheet pans, someone's radio playing something fast and bright that didn't match the mood of the room. What did you say? She asked. That I didn't know. Marco looked at her steadily. Fiora, this is not... You should understand what kind of attention this is. I understand what kind of man he is, Marco. Do you? She thought about what she'd read, about what she'd heard, about the way 3 men had gone very still when he said the word Friday, the way the temperature of the room had changed, about the envelope. I understand enough, she said. Marco was quiet for a moment. Then, he left something for you. He placed a small card on the bar between them, heavy stock, cream-colored, with a phone number printed in clean serif type and nothing else. No name, no words. Fiora looked at it without touching it. You don't have to call, Marco said. That's entirely your choice. Whatever happens in this restaurant is one thing. What happens outside of it is another. She picked up the card, turned it over. The back was blank. She put it in her apron pocket and went back to restocking the bar. And Marco watched her for a moment with that expression that mixed appreciation with something uncomfortably close to fear. And then he walked away. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in October, performing a preview of winter, the wind off the lake carrying a cold that felt personal, that felt directed, that had your particular name on it if you were standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Fiora walked home the long way again. By the time she reached Halstead Street, the card in her apron pocket felt like it weighed considerably more than a piece of cardstock should. She did not call that night. But she didn't throw it away. She called on a Sunday. She'd spent Friday and Saturday telling herself she wouldn't, cataloging the reasons with the methodical thoroughness of a woman who trusted her own better judgment. She had a job she was good at. She had a life that was small but intact. The apartment on Halstead, the twice-weekly calls to her aunt in Philadelphia, the novel she'd been trying to write for 2 years on Sunday mornings when the light came in right. She had no particular desire to complicate any of it. She called on Sunday because Sunday mornings, when the light came in right, she had trouble lying to herself. The phone rang twice. Fiora. Not a question. He'd been expecting her. She sat with that for a moment. You know my name. I know quite a lot about you. A pause, not uncomfortable, but weighted. I didn't call you. I left the choice to you. That was deliberately done. Yes. She looked out her window at the October sky, which was doing its best impression of slate. A pigeon was walking the ledge of the building across the street with the methodical purposefulness of urban birds everywhere. She thought about the conversation she'd overheard, the one she'd been carefully not thinking about for 11 days. I should tell you, she said, that I don't pretend well. I did it that night because the situation required it, and I'm good at my job. But in my personal life, I'm not built for pretending. Another pause, longer this time. What is it you think you're pretending about? That I don't know who you are, what you are. The words sat between them in the phone's silence, and she had time to regret their precision. Not because they were wrong, but because they were the kind of directness that could go one of only 2 ways, and she wasn't entirely sure she could predict which. That, he said finally, is exactly why I left the card. She frowned. I don't follow. The woman who stood at my table 2 Thursdays ago and heard what she heard. She had 3 choices. She could pretend she heard nothing, which is what most people do. She could leave and not come back, which would have been sensible. Or she could continue pouring my wine with the exact same expression on her face, finish the service, and go home. He paused. You chose the third option. I wanted to know why. Fiora was quiet for a moment. Outside, the pigeon had been joined by another, and they were conducting some kind of negotiation over a piece of bread that she couldn't quite see. Because it was my job, she said. No. His voice had something gentle in it, not warmth exactly, but precision applied with care, the way a surgeon's hands were gentle not from feeling, but from understanding the cost of imprecision. That's the answer you give when you're not sure yet whether to trust someone. Try again. She hadn't expected that. She found, to her slight irritation, that she didn't have an immediate response. Because panicking wouldn't have helped, she said finally. Because I was closer to the door than you were, and if something was going to happen, it would have happened before I could do anything about it. And because... She stopped. Because, he prompted. Because I didn't believe you were going to hurt me. I don't know why I believed that. It wasn't logical, but I did. The silence this time had a different quality. She couldn't see his face, couldn't use any of the tools she'd developed for reading people in physical space, and she found she wanted to. Found she was suddenly sharply aware of the gap between a voice on a phone and a person in a room, and how much information that gap erased. Have dinner with me, he said. She'd known it was coming. That didn't make it simpler. That seems unwise. Almost certainly. You're my employer. The restaurant employs you. I own the restaurant. That's a meaningful distinction. Is it? In this context, yes. In other contexts, no. I'm aware of the complexity. Fiora almost laughed. It surprised her. She hadn't expected to find him funny, hadn't expected the slight dry precision of that last sentence to land the way it did. Friday, she said, before she'd consciously decided to. Not the restaurant. Somewhere I can leave if I need to. Of course. No hesitation. I'll send you the address. I don't need to be picked up. I wasn't planning to. A pause. Fiora, I'm aware that you're doing the calculation right now, assessing what you're walking into. I want you to know that the calculation is correct, and that the answer is, you should be careful. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. She held that for a moment. Most men trying to get a woman to have dinner with them don't open with a warning. I'm not most men. No, she said quietly. I don't think you are. The address he sent was a restaurant on the 32nd floor of a building in River North that she'd walked past 100 times and never been inside. Not one of the Falcone properties. She'd checked. Neutral ground, then. The thought was both reassuring and unsettling in equal measure, because it meant he'd considered the optics, had thought about what the choice of venue would communicate, had made a deliberate decision to communicate something specific. She wore the black dress she'd bought on sale at a shop on Michigan Avenue and never had occasion to use. She did her hair. She walked the 12 blocks to the restaurant in her good heels because she didn't want to arrive having been transported by him in any way, and the October wind tried to take her apart at the seams, and she arrived slightly breathless and entirely herself, which was the point. He was already there. He stood when she approached the table, an old-fashioned gesture, slightly formal, and yet on him it didn't read as performance. It read as the expression of a set of values so deeply internalized they'd become automatic, like breathing. You walked, he said. How do you know? Your cheeks, he gestured slightly. And you're exactly on time, not 3 minutes early, which means you were close enough to time your approach. She sat down and looked at him across the table in the candlelight and the view of the city spreading out below them like a scattered handful of diamonds, and she thought, this is a man who pays attention to everything, every small detail, every small choice, every degree of color in a person's face, and she thought, that is both the most attractive and the most alarming thing about him. You do that with everyone? She asked. Read them? He considered. Yes. Does it get lonely? The question surprised him. She could see it, a slight shift behind those smoke-colored eyes, a recalibration. What makes you ask that? When you see everything, there's nothing left to discover, she said. That seems lonely. He looked at her for a long moment. The city glittered below them. Someone at a neighboring table laughed at something, a high, bright sound that seemed to come from a different world entirely. I haven't found that to be true, he said slowly. Until recently. The implication was clear enough that she didn't need to pursue it. Instead, she picked up the menu and looked at it, and let the conversation find its own level, which it did, easily, surprisingly easily, given everything it was navigating around. They talked for 3 hours. She left at midnight. He didn't ask to see her home. She walked back to Halstead Street in the October cold and thought about the way he'd looked at her when she asked if it was lonely, the quality of the surprise, the thing that had moved behind his eyes. She thought about the fact that she'd surprised him and that he'd let her see it, and what it meant that he'd chosen to. Upstairs, she sat at her kitchen table and opened her laptop and the document she'd been trying to write for 2 years. She stared at it for a while. Then she began to type. There were things she didn't ask him on that first dinner, and things he didn't offer, and the architecture of what was left unsaid between them was as important as the conversation itself. He called the following Tuesday. Not a text, he called, which she was beginning to understand was characteristic of him, a preference for the real-time negotiation of voice over the managed distance of text. You could edit a text. You couldn't edit a voice. Sunday, he said, I want to show you something. That's vague. Deliberately. She could hear something in his voice that she was starting to recognize. Not quite amusement, but its near relation. The slight softening at the edges of his precision when she said something he found unexpected. I'll pick you up at 10. I said I didn't need to be picked up. That was for the restaurant. This is different. I want you to be comfortable. She thought about what comfortable meant when the man saying it occupied the position he did. She thought about the 3 men with the still shoulders and the word Friday and the envelope. She thought about the way he'd stood up when she arrived, the old-fashioned genuineness of it, and the way he'd listened to her for 3 hours with the focused attention of a man who was accustomed to finding most conversations insufficient. 10, she agreed. He arrived in a black car driven by a man he introduced as Vin, whose last name she wasn't given. Vin was somewhere in his 50s, with a face that had absorbed a great deal of Chicago weather without complaint. And he drove the way the best drivers drove, with a kind of collaborative attentiveness to the flow of the city that made the car feel like part of the infrastructure rather than a vehicle moving through it. Nero was already in the back seat. He was dressed differently than she'd seen him, still precise, still expensive, but less formal. Dark jeans, a gray sweater that looked Italian, a coat that probably cost more than her television. He looked at her when she got in, with that particular directness he had. The look that assessed and catalogued, but had, she was learning, no cruelty in it. Good morning, he said. Where are we going? Pilsen. She raised her eyebrows. Pilsen was not where she would have predicted. It was a neighborhood of murals and coffee shops and Mexican restaurants, the kind of Chicago neighborhood that had been working class for generations and was now in the tender, contested process of becoming something more complicated. Not, on its surface, the territory of a man like Nero Falcone. You look skeptical, he said. I'm recalibrating. I do that to people. They drove south through the late October morning, the lake visible in glimpses between buildings, the city doing its Sunday thing, slower, looser, the hard civic geometry softened by the absence of the weekday crowd. Nero said little. He wasn't uncomfortable with silence. She'd noticed this at dinner, the ease with which he occupied quiet, as though silence were simply another room in a house he lived in. She said, after a while, "Tell me something true." He turned his head slightly. "What would you like to know?" "Something you don't tell most people. Not because I'm special, we've had one dinner, but because you're in the habit of being careful, and I'd like to know what's underneath the care." A long pause. They were crossing the river, and she could see the gray-green water below, the bridges, the geometry of the city folding over itself. "My father built something that I inherited," he said finally. "And when I say built, I mean that in all the senses the word applies to, the legal architecture and the other kind. He was a man who solved problems. He was good at it. He was also not kind exactly, but fair, in the way that certain kinds of men are fair. Rules applied to everyone, including himself. He looked out the window. He died of a heart attack at 59, in his office, alone. The quality of that last word, the weight placed on alone, told her more than the rest of the sentence. "I'm sorry," she said. And then, because she thought he would appreciate precision, not for what he was, for what it cost you. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, not the way faces shifted in films, but in the small, real way that people's faces shifted when something reached them. "My brother is better suited to the visible world," he said. "He goes to the galas. He speaks to the press. He has a wife and children and a house in Winnetka and a life that looks, from a reasonable distance, entirely conventional. And yours doesn't." "No." "Is that a choice?" He seemed to consider the question genuinely, which she was learning to recognize as one of his qualities, the willingness to give real consideration to things that other people would answer reflexively. "Partly. The work chose me as much as I chose it. But I could have refused it. Other men have." A pause. "I didn't want to. That's the more honest answer." "Why not?" "Because I'm good at it. And because the order of it, the way things are supposed to run. I have a particular feeling about disorder, about things not being what they should be." He said this without drama, without the self-consciousness that would have made it less true. Most people experience that as a preference. For me, it's something closer to a physical response. Fiora thought about this. The car had entered Pilsen, and through the window she could see the first of the murals. A woman's face, 20 feet high, painted in blues and ochres on the side of a warehouse, her eyes looking south with an expression of focused endurance that seemed to know exactly what it was doing on that particular wall. "Control," she said quietly. "Yes." "And when you can't control something?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm working on that," he said, and there was something in his voice then, not quite humor, not quite admission, something in the joint between the two, that made her want to look at him directly, and she did, and found him already looking at her with an expression she couldn't categorize and wasn't sure she wanted to. He took her to a building on the 18th Street corridor, an old industrial space that had been converted, with extraordinary care, into something she hadn't expected, a community arts center. Murals in progress on the interior walls, tables where children were drawing with enormous focused seriousness, an older woman teaching printmaking to a group of teenagers, the smell of paint and wood and the good institutional smell of a place being used for exactly what it was meant for. "You funded this," she said, not a question. "The foundation did." He was standing slightly apart, watching a boy of about 8 apply an enormous brushstroke of cadmium yellow to a canvas that was nearly as tall as he was. Anonymously. "Why anonymously?" "Because it's not about me." She looked at him for a long moment. The boy with the yellow paint made a sound of satisfaction and stepped back to assess his work, and the sound was so purely pleased with itself that she almost smiled. "You're more complicated than you want to be," she said. "Most people are. Most people don't go to the lengths you do to conceal it." He turned to look at her. "And you don't conceal yours?" "I'm a waitress in a restaurant you own. My complications are not particularly dangerous to anyone." "That," he said, "is the first thing you've said that I think isn't entirely true." She opened her mouth and closed it again. He had a quality she was discovering she found both challenging and, if she was being honest with herself in the way Sunday mornings required, compelling. The ability to say something precise and then let it sit, fully confident that it could support its own weight without additional structure. They spent 2 hours in the building. She spoke to the older woman about printmaking. She'd taken a class at DePaul before she'd had to leave, and the technique came back to her hands with the easy fluency of things learned before loss. He watched her. On the drive back, she fell asleep for 20 minutes, which she hadn't intended. She woke when the car stopped, to find that they were on Halsted Street, and that he was watching her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Unguarded, slightly unresolved. the expression of a man who had looked at something he hadn't expected to find moving, and found it moving anyway. "Thank you," she said, which was inadequate and the best she had. "Next Sunday," he said. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. November arrived like a decision. One day the city was performing its extended autumn, the golden hour light lingering past its allotted time, the leaves on the oaks in Lincoln Park making their long, colorful argument against departure. And the next morning Fiora woke to a sky the color of old pewter and a wind that had stopped pretending it was anything other than winter. She had dinner with Nero 4 times in November. Each time it was different in the specific way that mattered, the location, the details, and the same in the ways that were beginning to feel structural, foundational, the weight-bearing walls of something she wasn't yet ready to name. The conversations went long. He listened with a quality of attention she'd begun to privately categorize as remarkable, not because he remembered everything she said, though he did, but because he seemed to genuinely want to understand the architecture of her thinking, not just its conclusions. He asked questions the way a skilled cartographer noted landmarks, not to show off the map, but to make it more accurate. She told him about the novel. Not what it was about, she wasn't ready for that, but that it existed, that she'd been trying to write it for 2 years, that it kept changing shape on her when she wasn't looking. "That's frustrating," he said. "Not frustrating exactly, more like, it's telling me something I'm not ready to hear." He looked at her across the table with the particular quality of his attention. "What do you think it's telling you?" "That I'm still in the middle of the story I'm trying to write about." He was quiet for a moment. "You're writing about your mother." She hadn't said that. She looked at him, and he returned her look without apology, because he wasn't wrong and they both knew it, and the absence of apology was its own kind of acknowledgement. "Among other things," she said. "Tell me about her." It was the 3rd week of November, and they were in a restaurant in the West Loop with high ceilings and low light and a wine list that ran to 40 pages. And she told him about her mother, Lucia Esposito, born in Napoli, who had come to Chicago at 22 with her husband, who had stayed when he left, who had raised a daughter on the wages of a woman who worked in the garment district and later in a clothing alteration shop on Taylor Street, who had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer 3 days after Fiora's 25th birthday, and who had died 22 months later on a Tuesday morning in March, holding Fiora's hand and trying to apologize for the inconvenience. Nero listened to all of it without once checking his phone or looking away. When she finished, the table was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like someone who survived by deciding things," he said. Fiora blinked. "Yes, exactly that. She decided things and then she lived by them, even when they weren't the easiest decisions, even when she was wrong. You inherited that." "She'd be horrified to hear you say so. She thought I was reckless." The corner of his mouth moved. She wasn't wrong. "Are you calling me reckless?" "I'm calling you someone who makes decisions," he said, "which looks like recklessness to people who don't." She thought about the night she'd poured his wine and heard the word Friday and kept pouring. She thought about the card she hadn't thrown away. She thought about calling him on a Sunday. "You're here," she said. "That could be characterized as a decision." "It is a decision." He said it simply, without qualification or the fencing that most conversations employed to protect themselves from meaning exactly what they meant. "I'm aware of what it is." Fiora picked up her wine glass. The light in the restaurant caught the red of it and held it there, suspended, and she looked at it rather than at him, because sometimes you needed something to look at that wasn't a person looking back. "Nero," she set the glass down. "The things I heard that first night, I haven't forgotten them. I know. I'm not going to pretend I don't know what kind of man you are outside this restaurant, what kind of work." "No," he said, "I wouldn't want you to." "Then you understand why I'm telling you that I need to be honest with you about what this is and isn't, because I'm not built to live in the version of this where I pretend." He looked at her steadily. The restaurant moved around them, other people's evenings in progress, the soft percussion of cutlery, the undercurrent of other conversations. "What is it, then?" he asked, "in your honest assessment?" "Something I didn't expect," she said. Something that I probably shouldn't want and find myself wanting anyway. Something that frightens me in specific ways that I'm trying to be adult about. And what isn't it? She looked at him. A mistake. I've made mistakes. This doesn't feel like one. The silence after that was the kind that had shape to it, weight and dimension, the silence of something settling into place. I need you to understand something, he said finally. His voice had a different quality now, not the dinner conversation voice, not the slightly dry precision of the man who could be almost funny. This was the voice from the restaurant, the first night, the one that carried the temperature of absolute certainty. The world I live in, the real world, not the restaurants and the foundation and the galas, it doesn't keep separate what it touches. It is not possible for you to be here in this version of our Thursday nights and remain entirely apart from the other version. I know. I'm not sure you do, not fully. I want to offer you the things that are good, the things I know how to give. But I cannot promise you safe. I cannot promise you uncomplicated. What I can promise you, he stopped. And it was the stopping that undid her slightly. The fact that a man who chose his words with such exactitude had paused because the words themselves required care. I can promise you honest, he said. I can promise you that I won't pretend you're something to be managed. And I can promise you that whatever you become to me with full accounting. Not a variable, not a complication, not something to be handled. Fiora held his gaze across the table, across the red wine and the candlelight and the distance between who they were and who they were becoming. What do I become? She asked softly. I don't know yet, he said, but I intend to find out. She was restocking the bar on a Thursday 2 weeks later when a man she hadn't seen before came into the restaurant and asked, very politely, to speak with the manager. Marco spoke with him for 12 minutes in the office near the kitchen and emerged looking like he'd aged 3 years. Private party tomorrow night, Marco said when Fiora asked. Full restaurant, black tie. I need you here. Who is it? Marco straightened his jacket. The Marchetti family. The name rang a bell she hadn't known she had. The Marchetti shipment, the word Friday, the voice carrying under the ambient noise of the restaurant 2 months ago. She felt the small internal adjustment of pieces connecting, the way a story clarified itself when a character returned. I'll be here, she said. Marco looked at her for a long moment. Fiora, be careful tomorrow. You keep saying that. I keep meaning it. That night she texted Nero, the first time she'd texted him, having previously waited for his calls. 3 words, Marchetti, tomorrow night. His response came 4 minutes later. I know, stay near the service bar. She looked at her phone, then she typed, Are you going to be there? The response took longer this time. When it came, it was 2 words, watching out. She didn't sleep well. The restaurant transformed for private events in a way that reminded Fiora of theater. The same space, the same bones, but dressed in a different light, a different intention. Extra candles on every surface, white orchids in tall glass vases, the good tablecloths, the ones Marco kept in tissue paper in the storage room and only brought out for evenings that required the full weight of the restaurant's dignity. The Marchetti party arrived at 8, 46 people filling the restaurant to the boundaries of its capacity. They were a family in the broad Italian-American sense. Not just blood relations, but the extended architecture of alliance and history that certain families constructed over generations and maintained with the care of a national monument. There were old men in dinner jackets and young men in dinner jackets, and women in silk and pearls, and the particular kind of composed attention that women in these families learned early. At the center of it, a man who could only have been the patriarch. Aldo Marchetti was in his late 60s, silver-haired, with the physical stillness of someone who had spent 50 years being the most important person in any room he entered. He was accompanied by a woman she assumed was his wife, and by a younger man, late 20s, dark and restless-eyed, who had his father's bone structure and none of his composure. The younger man's name was Dante. She learned this within 20 minutes, from the way people said it, with a slight deference that was not quite the same deference they gave his father. Dante Marchetti moved through the room the way young men moved when they were aware of being watched for the right reasons and hadn't yet decided whether to enjoy it or resent it. He noticed her within the first 30 minutes. It was a particular kind of noticing, different from Nero's assessment, which was deliberate and contained. Dante Marchetti's attention was less disciplined, more openly acquisitive. He was at the bar when she was collecting a tray of drinks, and he turned with the practiced ease of a man who had learned that being where women were was generally a good strategy. "You work here," he said. "I do." She kept her attention on the tray. "What's your name?" "Fiora." "Fiora." He said it with a slight emphasis, testing the sound of it. "That's a beautiful name." She'd been told this before, and had a range of responses deployed for the various contexts in which it was deployed. "Thank you," she said, and lifted the tray. "Are you Italian?" "My parents were." "From where?" "Napoli." She looked at him briefly. "Will you need anything else from the bar?" He smiled, a practiced smile, but not an unpleasant one. He was probably charming in most circumstances. "Not from the bar," he said. She walked away without responding, which was its own kind of response. At 10:15, the temperature of the room changed. It was the same shift she'd felt the first Thursday, the slight atmospheric adjustment, the collective lowering of voices. She was clearing a table near the front window when it happened, and she turned toward the door. Nero. He wasn't dressed for the event. He wore a dark suit, but not formal wear, which meant his presence was operational, not social. He was accompanied by Luca, his brother, who she recognized from photographs and who was indeed more openly warm-faced than Nero, with the same dark coloring but a lighter way of occupying a room. And behind both of them, two of the three men with still shoulders. He didn't look at her when he came in. But she felt the change in her own attention, the way the room reorganized itself for her, suddenly, around the new axis of his presence. Marco intercepted them near the door. A brief exchange. Then Nero and Luca moved toward the back of the restaurant, toward Aldo Marchetti's table, and Marco came to find her with the particular expression she'd been seeing more of lately. "Continue your service," Marco said quietly. "Don't cluster near the back." "What is this, Marco?" "Business." She nodded and went back to work. But she was aware, with the precise, controlled awareness she'd developed over 2 months of understanding what that first Thursday had introduced into her life, of the movement at the back of the room, of the handshakes, of the way the old men's conversation had the quality of something concluding rather than beginning. At 11, she was at the service bar preparing a dessert order when she felt someone behind her. Close, closer than propriety suggested. "I think we should finish our conversation," Dante Marchetti said. She set down the dessert plate with great care. "I wasn't aware we'd started one." "Then we should start one. You've been impressive tonight. Efficient." "That's my job." "You're wasted in a job," he said, and she could smell the wine on him now, not drunk, but loosened. "What are you doing after tonight?" "Going home," she said. "Excuse me." She turned, and he was standing exactly close enough to require her to turn around him rather than through him, which was the kind of spatial tactic that men deployed when they wanted to demonstrate that they could. She did it smoothly, without contact, and he let her go, but she felt his eyes follow her, and when she glanced across the room, she found Nero at the far side of it. He was looking directly at her. Not at Dante, at her, with an expression that she'd never seen on his face before, contained, controlled, but with something underneath the control that had an edge she recognized. She gave the smallest shake of her head. "I'm fine." His gaze moved to Dante Marchetti. It rested there for 3 seconds. Then he turned back to his conversation. The party ended at 1 in the morning. She was collecting glasses when she found Nero in the alcove, the last table on the left, where it had started, which struck her as either poetic or deeply strange. "Dante Marchetti spoke to you," he said. "Not an accusation, but not one either. I work in a restaurant, Nero. Men speak to me." "Not like that." She set down her tray and looked at him. "Like what?" "Like you're something he could have." "I'm not." "I know that." A pause. He was sitting with his elbows on the table, slightly forward, which was unusual for him. He normally occupied space with a kind of deliberate ease that held something back. This held nothing back. "It doesn't change the fact that I found it..." "Difficult?" she offered. He looked at her. Yes. She sat down across from him, which was also unusual. She hadn't sat at a table in the restaurant, not with him, not in this context. It felt like a declaration of some kind. Nero, I told you I wasn't built for pretending. That applies in both directions. I'm not going to stand here and tell you it was fine if it wasn't fine for you. But I need you to also hear me when I say that I handled it. That I'm capable of handling it. That whatever you feel about the Dante Marchettis of the world, it's not about Marchetti. Then what? He was quiet for a moment. The restaurant was empty now, except for the closing crew at the far end. The candles were burning low. The orchids drooped slightly. I've spent 15 years, he said, managing things. People, situations, threats. I'm good at it. It's what I do. He looked at his hands. I don't know how to manage this. She understood, suddenly and fully, what he was saying. Not the surface statement, but the cost of it. The specific difficulty, for a man who had built his entire life around the architecture of control, of encountering something that resisted that architecture. That couldn't be managed because it was living and particular and wouldn't hold still long enough to be categorized. You're not supposed to manage it, she said quietly. He looked up at her. The candlelight made his face look different, younger somehow, less composed. I know, he said. That's what concerns me. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked down at it, her hand on his, the simple fact of it. And for a moment, his face had the expression of a man looking at something he had wanted for a long time and hadn't quite believed would arrive. They did not rush. This, she thought later, was one of the truest things about those early months, the deliberateness of it, the way they built toward each other with the care that complex things required. He called, she answered. They had dinner and walked in the cold and talked about things that mattered. Her novel, his brother's children who he visited on Sunday afternoons, the community center in Pilsen where she'd started volunteering on Saturdays, the books they'd both read and the disagreements those books generated, which were significant and enjoyable and told them a great deal about each other. He was not a man who touched easily. This she observed carefully, not with disappointment, but with recognition. There were people who deployed touch the way some people deployed words, casually and frequently, and there were people for whom touch had specific weight, for whom every contact was a decision. Nero was the second kind, and she had learned to feel the decisions being made even when they were small. The way he put his hand briefly on the small of her back when they entered a room together. The way he'd taken her hand on the walk home after the Marchetti night, which had been the first time, and which he'd done with such a complete absence of theater that it felt less like a gesture than a fact being stated. December made them bolder. There was something about December in Chicago, the cold that didn't negotiate, the way the city doubled down on warmth in response, the particular urgency that the end of one year imparted to things that were still becoming. They spent a Saturday afternoon at the Art Institute, which she had loved since childhood, and he let her lead him through the galleries with the slightly formal attentiveness of a man who didn't know art well, but knew how to be present in the presence of something being offered. She stopped in front of Seurat's A Sunday on La Grande Jatte. I used to stand in front of this painting for hours when I was a student, she said, trying to understand how it worked, how something made of dots could look more like a real afternoon than any photograph. He stood beside her, and she was aware, as she had become increasingly aware, of the specific quality of his presence. The way he occupied space differently from other people, with a density that had nothing to do with physical bulk. The dots hold space between them, he said. She looked at him. What? The technique. It only works because each point of color has space around it. If they touched, the colors would merge and go flat. He paused. The distance between things is what makes the image possible. She looked at the painting, then at him. Is that personal observation or art criticism? Both, he said, and when she looked at his face, she found that slight softening at the edges of his precision that she'd come to understand as the closest thing he did to a smile when something amused him genuinely. She laughed, and he turned his face toward the sound of it, and for a moment they were simply two people standing in a gallery on a cold Saturday in December, which was such an ordinary thing, and yet. He took her, in the second week of December, to the penthouse, She'd known it existed. The address she'd found in a profile of Falcone Holdings listed a River North building she passed regularly, a glass and steel tower with the clean bones of good architecture. She hadn't asked to see it. He hadn't offered until he did, which was another Thursday evening, after dinner, when he said simply, "I'd like you to see where I live." Which was not a small thing, she understood. Not from any man, but particularly not from this man. The building had a private elevator. The elevator opened directly into the apartment, the full upper floor, floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides, the city laid out below them like an exhibit of itself. The lake was dark at this hour, or rather, it was the color of the sky, which was the deep blue-black of a December night with cloud cover, and the city lights reflected in it made the boundary between water and sky uncertain, the city extending in both directions into infinite possibility. The interior was exactly what she would have expected, and nothing like what she'd imagined. The materials were right: dark wood, clean lines, furniture that was chosen rather than accumulated. But there were books everywhere, organized in ways that told stories, not alphabetically, not by color or size, but in groupings that suggested conversations between ideas. There were photographs, not many, but placed with intention. Luca's children, a landscape she didn't recognize that she later learned was the coastline south of Naples, where his father had grown up. And one image, in a simple frame on the desk in the study, that she looked at for a long moment. A woman in her 40s with the dark Falcone coloring and an expression that combined great warmth with absolute determination. His mother. "She looks like someone who survived by deciding things," Fiora said. He was standing behind her. She felt him go very still at the echo of what she'd said about her own mother 2 months ago at the table. "Yes," he said quietly. She turned to face him. They were standing close in the small study, close enough that the distance between them was a decision being made in real time. His face, in the low light of the study, had the quality she'd been seeing more of lately. The unguarded version, the one without the full weight of his composure. "Nero," she said. "Fiora." He reached up and touched her face, just a fingertip, along the line of her jaw, with the specific deliberateness that characterized everything he did. She turned her face slightly into it, which was its own kind of statement. He kissed her the way he did everything, with complete attention and no hurry. It lasted a long time, or a short time. She lost track of the measurement of it in the simple, overwhelming fact of it. When they finally separated, the city was still below them, and the lake was still dark, and she was still herself, though with the strong sense that she was standing at the edge of a significant change in the landscape. "I've been thinking about that for 3 months, he said. "I know," she said. "So have I." He looked at her in the lamplight with an expression she'd never quite seen on his face before. Open, slightly vulnerable, in the way that powerful men were vulnerable when they allowed themselves to be. And she thought, this is the part of him that the restaurant never sees. This is the room under all the other rooms. She stayed until 2 in the morning. He drove her home himself, which meant she met the black car and Vin again, and Vin's face was entirely impassive, but his eyes in the rearview mirror had something in them that might have been satisfaction. January arrived with an agenda. She was aware in the first weeks of the new year that something had shifted in the operational world that surrounded them like weather. She felt it in the way Nero's calls came at different hours than usual, in the way their Thursday dinner in the second week was canceled with 3 hours' notice and replaced by a text. "Friday, I'll explain." And in the way Marco moved through the restaurant with the particular focused caution of a man navigating something he couldn't name. "Friday, as promised." "The Marchetti situation has become complicated," Nero said, without preamble, because he never used preamble when the absence of it was more efficient. They were in the penthouse. She'd come directly from a Saturday shift, still in her work clothes, and he'd met her at the elevator with a quality of attention she recognized as something other than the usual. Alert, the way a predator was alert, all the usual social furniture set aside. "Tell me," she said. "I don't want to manage what you know and don't know," he said. "I told you I wouldn't, but there are things I can't tell you, operational things. Not because I don't trust you, because knowing them would make you responsible for me knowing them," she said, "and that changes what you can and can't do to protect me." He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, the slight recalibration she'd come to recognize. "Yes, exactly that. Then tell me what you can." He was quiet for a moment. He was standing at the window, The city behind him in its January austerity, the lake frozen to its near shore, the buildings throwing sharp shadows in the cold afternoon light. Dante Marchetti has been making statements about this restaurant, about, he paused carefully, about the people in it. She was very still. What kind of statements? The kind that are meant to reach me. His voice was even. They have reached me. And what does that mean, practically? Practically, it means I'd like you to be careful, in a specific way. Not to change your life. I am not going to ask you to change your life. That is not a request I'm going to make. But to be aware of who is around you, of anything that feels wrong. She processed this. Is this because of what I heard? That first night? Partly. He turned from the window. And partly it's because of what you've become to me, which Dante has apparently observed and has opinions about. The flat directness of what you've become to me landed in her chest the way simple true things did, without warning. He's using me to get at you, she said. He's trying to demonstrate that I have something that can be reached. A pause. I've never had that before. Not that could be reached this way. She looked at him across the room. Miro, I need you to be honest with me about the level of risk. Moderate, he said. Not severe. Dante Marchetti is ambitious and reckless, but he is not, at this point, willing to take the action that would constitute a declaration. What he's doing is theater, signaling. He paused. But theater sometimes escalates. And if it does? Then I will handle it. The certainty in his voice was not performance. It was structural. The voice of a man who had built an infrastructure specifically for handling things, and who knew its capacity precisely. But I'd rather you knew. She crossed the room to him, which felt like the right thing to do. She stood close to him, not touching, just present in the specific way that sometimes communicated things better than contact did. I'm not going to run, she said. I know. He said it with something that might have been relief, or gratitude, or both. I know you're not. But I need to know something. Ask. Is this what we have? Is this going to make it worse? For you? The situation with Marchetti? Because if my being here is making your work harder, making something that was already complicated more complicated, then I need to... No. The word was immediate and definitive. Whatever the complications, they were coming. The Marchetti situation is not about you. The fact that he's attempting to use you that's a tactical choice on his part. It doesn't change anything that was already in motion. He paused, and then said something she hadn't expected. You make it easier, actually. She looked up at him. How? He was quiet for a moment. I have spent 15 years with a very narrow range of things I was willing to fight for. The work, my family, my people. He looked at her steadily. That's changed. She understood what he was saying and didn't require it to be said more plainly. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw. The first time she'd initiated touch in that way, with that specific intention, and he turned his face slightly into it, the way she had turned her face into his, months ago, in the study. 3 days later, she was walking home from the restaurant, the short way because it was 11 degrees and she was tired, when she became aware of a car that had been behind her for 2 blocks, moving at the speed of a person walking. She stopped at a crosswalk. The car stopped. She walked. The car moved. She didn't run. She walked steadily, keeping the same pace, and turned into the brightness of a 7-Eleven on the corner, not the direction of her apartment, deliberately, and stood in the fluorescent light and called Nero. He answered on the first ring. There's a car, she said. It's been behind me for 2 blocks. I'm in the 7-Eleven on Halsted and Division. A pause of perhaps 2 seconds. Stay where you are. Don't go outside. I'm sending Vin. Nero, stay where you are. She stayed. She bought a bottle of water she didn't need and stood near the register and talked to the cashier about the weather, which the cashier found odd but accommodated. Vin was there in 14 minutes, which meant he'd been nearby, which meant Nero had had someone keeping proximity without telling her, and she had feelings about that, but not the feelings she would have predicted. because the 14 minutes of standing in a 7-Eleven in January had given her some perspective on the various ways people could organize themselves. The car was gone when she went outside. Vin drove her to the penthouse, which was where they'd both apparently decided she was going, and she arrived to find Nero on the phone, a short, low conversation that ended when she walked in, conducted in a tone she hadn't heard before and filed away carefully. "Who was in the car?" she asked when he'd put the phone down. "We're finding out." "Marchetti?" "Probably." His jaw was tight. "Fiora, I'm fine." "I know. You handled it correctly." A pause. "I should have had Vin closer." "You had him within 14 minutes. It's not close enough." He said it with the quiet finality of a man updating a calculation and not liking the result. "I'll have someone with you. When you're not in the restaurant. When you're not here." "Nero." She kept her voice even. "I understand the impulse, but I need you to hear me on this. If someone is with me everywhere I go, I lose something. I lose a kind of autonomy that matters to me. That is not a small thing." He looked at her. "And if something happens to you, then I'm a grown woman who made an informed choice." She crossed to him, put her hand on his arm. "I know the risk. I'm choosing to be here. Let that be my choice." The muscle in his jaw worked. "You're the most difficult person I've ever—" "You knew that when you left the card." A pause. Then, very quietly, almost against his will, "Yes, I did." She met Luca Falcone properly on a Wednesday in late January at a restaurant in Wicker Park that Luca had chosen and that was not, she noticed, a Falcone property. She understood the choice immediately. Luca wanted to speak to her on ground that was neither his nor his brother's. Neutral, again, but this time with a different purpose than Nero's original selection of a first date. This time it was an interview. He was, as she'd guessed from photographs, easier on the surface than his brother. The same coloring, the same fundamental bone structure, but with a quality of accessibility that Nero simply didn't have. He smiled readily. He asked how she was in the way that invited a real answer. He was genuinely interested in other people in a way that Nero was specifically interested in her, which was different. He was also, she discovered in the first 10 minutes, considerably more direct than his brother. "I'll be honest with you," Luca said when their drinks arrived. "I've been trying to meet you for 2 months. He's protective of his private life. Aggressively so. The fact that he's told me about you at all is a significant thing." "What has he told you?" "Enough." Luca turned his glass. "That you work in the restaurant. That you heard something you shouldn't have and responded to it by continuing to do your job perfectly and going home. That he left you his number." He paused. "That you called." "That's a fairly complete summary." "He was impressed by you. Not, this sounds strange, not personally at first, professionally impressed. He respects competence. He respects people who understand situations and respond intelligently." Luca looked at her steadily. And then, apparently, the professional impression became something else. "It did," she said simply. Luca nodded. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone organizing what they actually wanted to say, rather than what they'd planned to say. "My brother has not—" he paused. "He has not been happy, in the normal human sense of that word, for a very long time. Since before my father died, probably, but accelerating after. He does his work, and his work is considerable, and he does it well. But there's a version of a person that needs more than that, and Nero has been running on less than that for years, and I've watched it, and it's—" He stopped. "It's hard to watch," Fiora finished. Luca looked at her. "Yes, exactly that. You love him. He's my brother. That's not the same thing, but yes, I know what you mean." Luca almost smiled. "Nero said you were direct." "He said I was reckless." "Same thing, for him." He set his glass down. "I want you to know, and I want you to know that I'm speaking for myself, not because Nero asked me to, or knows I'm saying this, that you have my support. Whatever that means to you." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you need to know that not everything in Nero's world is the Marchetti situation. That there are people in it who want—" He searched for the word. "Who want the thing that seems to be happening to happen, without interference." "Is there interference?" A pause. There are people who think that Nero having something he cares about, personally, outside the work, is a vulnerability. And they're not entirely wrong. It is a vulnerability, in the tactical sense. He looked at her steadily. But I've believed for a long time that the lack of it was a different kind of problem. She sat with that. Outside, Wicker Park moved in the cold, people walking quickly, heads down, the particular Chicago winter posture that communicated both discomfort and determination.
"Can I ask you something?" she said.
Please. What was he like before your father died? Luca considered this for a long time. There was more levity, he said finally. He's always been serious, but there was laughter. He used to argue about books, loudly, with my father, in the kitchen. He used to drag me to the Art Institute on Saturday mornings because he said it was the only place in the city that made him feel like time was running at the right speed. He paused. He took me there, apparently, last month. He took me too, she said. Luca looked at her with an expression she found hard to categorize. Gratitude, probably, mixed with something more complex. Yes, he said, I know. She told Nero about the lunch that evening, during a phone call, that she could hear the window sounds of the penthouse inn, the way the wind moved the glass, high up, a sound that she'd come to associate with him. He told you things, Nero said. He told me he wanted me to know I had support, and that not everyone in your world is about the Marchetti situation. A pause. He loves you very much. I know. He said it quietly, without the deflection that most people employed when someone said something emotionally exact about them. He told me about the Art Institute. A beat. He was always a talker. He said you used to argue about books with your father. The silence that followed was brief but specific. We did. My father liked Hemingway. I found Hemingway. I still find Hemingway aesthetically limited. We argued about this for years. A pause. He'd bring it up every time there was nothing else to argue about, which was the point, I think. She smiled, there in her apartment on Halsted Street, at the image of it. The two Falcone men in a kitchen, voices raised over Hemingway, the specific, warm combat of people who disagreed about the things that mattered to them because they could. Tell me about him, she said. He did, for an hour, which was more than he'd told her in the previous 3 months combined. She lay on her bed in the dark and listened to the voice of a man unloading something he'd been carrying for 7 years, carefully, the way you unloaded anything heavy, slowly, with attention to balance. February. Chicago in February was a test of character. The cold lost its novelty and became simply the condition of things, a gray, wind-abraded fact of daily life that sorted the city's population into those who endured it philosophically and those who did not. Fiora had always been the former. There was something honest about February's refusal to be anything other than what it was, and she'd grown up with the particular stubborn affection for this city that came from choosing to stay in it through its worst. She was at the restaurant on a Thursday when she heard, from across the service bar, a conversation she wasn't meant to hear. The speakers were 2 of the regular Thursday men, not from Nero's table, but from a table near the front that she'd always privately catalogued as allied but not central. They were speaking in the lowered voices of people who'd had just enough wine to loosen their discretion, and the words she caught were, Marchetti's made contact with Ricci, and Nero doesn't know yet. She continued filling water glasses. The conversation moved on. She carried the glasses to their tables. She finished her section. At close, when the restaurant had emptied and she was at the service bar alone, she thought about what she'd heard, and what Nero had told her about what she should and shouldn't know, and the distinction he'd drawn between operational knowledge that compromised her and knowledge that was simply factual. She texted him, "Overheard something tonight. I think you should know." He called immediately. She told him, precisely and briefly, what she'd heard, the names, the exact words. Silence. "You're certain about Ricci," he said. "That was the name." Another silence. "All right." His voice was flat, in the way it was when he was processing something against a larger map she couldn't see. "Thank you." "Is it bad?" "It's information." A pause. "It's the second time you've given me information I needed. from a position you didn't choose to be in. I didn't choose the first one, she said. I chose to tell you this one. I know the difference. He was quiet for a moment. Fiora, I need you to know that I'm... He stopped in the way she now recognized, the pause before something he was going to say with full weight. I'm aware of what you've taken on, in being here. I don't take it lightly. I know you don't. I want to give you something that isn't about the complications.
Something that's just... He stopped again.
She waited, because she'd learned to wait for him through the pauses. Come to Elmwood Park with me on Sunday. My mother wants to meet you. The sentence landed with considerable weight. Your mother, she said carefully. She's been asking. Since Christmas. A pause. I wanted to be certain of things before I... Are you certain now? A long pause. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. I've been certain for a while. I was being careful with it. Because it's large, she said, introducing me to your mother. It's large. Yes. She thought about Luca in Wicker Park, saying, I've believed for a long time that the lack of it was a different kind of problem. She thought about the penthouse and the photograph of his mother and the way he'd kissed her in the study with complete attention. Sunday, she said, I'll wear something appropriate. A pause. You don't have to... Nero, I know who your mother is. I'll wear something appropriate. She could hear the smile in his silence, which was becoming one of her favorite sounds. Carmela Falcone lived in a house on a tree-lined street in Elmwood Park that was entirely unlike anything she'd associated with the Falcone name. It was a house that had been lived in for 40 years, fully and without apology. Good furniture that had been used into softness, photographs covering every available surface, the smell of a kitchen that had been cooking since that morning, probably since before that. Carmela herself was in her late 60s, small, dark, with the Falcone coloring and an expression that combined great warmth with absolute determination. Exactly the woman in the photograph. She held Fiora's hands for a moment after Nero introduced them, studying her face with a directness that was entirely familial. You look like a woman who has managed her life, Carmela said, which was an assessment rather than a compliment, and which Fiora appreciated on exactly those terms. I try to, Fiora said. Sit down. I've made too much food. She had made, Fiora confirmed over the next 3 hours, an extraordinary amount of food, the kind of meal that had been in preparation for days, that expressed through its quantity and attention something about the significance of the occasion that nothing else could have communicated as clearly. Luca and his wife Elena were there, with their 2 children, a boy of 7 named Marco, after the restaurateur and possibly several other Marcos in the family's history, and a girl of 4 named Sofia, who attached herself to Fiora within the first 20 minutes with the complete confidence of small children and dogs, who always know. Nero sat beside her at the table and said little, which was characteristic, but his hand found hers under the tablecloth at some point during the meal, and stayed there, and Carmela, across the table, saw this and said nothing, but looked at her son with an expression that Fiora couldn't fully read from an angle. Later, while the men were putting the children to bed and Elena had disappeared into the kitchen, Carmela sat with Fiora in the front room with small glasses of Amaro and said, He told me about your mother. Fiora was quiet. Mine died when Nero was 12, Carmela said. Not me, his grandmother, my mother. She was the one who... She made a gesture. She was the anchor. For a long time, after she was gone, Nero was the one who held everything together. He was 12 years old, and he held everything together, because that's what he does. She looked at Fiora steadily. I worried for years that he wouldn't let anyone near enough, that the holding together had become so automatic that he couldn't stop. He let me near, Fiora said. Yes. Carmela turned her glass in her hands. He did. She was quiet for a moment. Be patient with him when he's difficult. He's not difficult. Carmela raised one eyebrow. You've known him 4 months. Fiora almost laughed. Pointed. He's his father's son, which means he is exactly as difficult as his father was, which was considerable. She said this with the specific fondness of someone who had loved someone difficult for 40 years and understood, completely, the cost and reward of it. But the reward is... She stopped, looking for words. I know, Fiora said. Carmela looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, once, in the same way Nero nodded when he'd reached a conclusion. "Good," she said, and refilled both their glasses. She knew something was wrong before he told her. She knew it in the particular quality of his Tuesday night call. Longer than usual, the conversational rhythms subtly altered, the way he asked about her day with a frequency that spoke of wanting to fill the space rather than genuine inquiry. She let it run its natural course, and then said, simply, "Tell me." A pause. "There's going to be a situation this week. Thursday." "At the restaurant?" "No, away from the restaurant. But the restaurant there may be some proximity." She understood. Something was going to happen, and the radius of its consequences would touch the restaurant, and she would be in the restaurant, and he was telling her not because she could do anything about it, but because he'd promised her honesty. "What should I do?" she asked. "Work your shift. Leave on time. Go home the way I showed you. Not through the alley on Division, the other way." "Is this the Marchetti thing?" A pause. "The Ricci connection you told me about. There's been a resolution being prepared." He was choosing words with extraordinary care. "Thursday is when that resolution is implemented." "Is anyone going to get hurt?" A longer pause. "That depends on the choices made by people who are not me." She thought about what that meant, the specific structure of that answer, the responsibility it both took and released. "Are you going to get hurt?" No. The certainty in it was absolute, and she believed it not because certainty was always true, but because this man, she had learned, did not deploy certainty lightly. "All right," she said. "That's it? All right? What would you like me to say, Nero?" Another pause. "I don't know. Most people would." "I'm not most people. You said so yourself." She paused. "I'll take the other way home. Be careful." "Fiora." "Yes." He stopped. The pause was longer than the others, weighted differently. She had come to understand his pauses the way you understood musical rests, not as absence, but as duration, as the thing that gave the notes around them their shape. "I need you to know." "I know," she said gently. "I haven't said it. You've been saying it for months, in every language you have." The silence after that was full of something she couldn't name and didn't need to. Thursday. She worked her shift. She was professional and pleasant and brought the bread warm and smiled at the middle distance and did every small thing correctly. And the restaurant was normal, and the Thursday regulars were their usual selves, and nothing happened inside the walls of Trattoria Rossetti. She left at 11, 10 minutes before close, at Marco's quiet instruction. She went the other way home, down streets well lit and populated, the cold air sharp and present, the city doing its nighttime business around her with the comfortable indifference of infrastructure. Her phone vibrated at 11:42, a text from Nero. "Done. All right." She stood on Halsted Street in the orange light of the street lamp and held the phone and felt the specific quality of that moment, the relief that was more than relief, the way it moved through her like something physical. She typed back, "Good. Come when you can." He arrived at her apartment at 1 in the morning. She'd left the light on. He looked not different, not visibly changed in any way she could precisely identify, but with the quality of a man who had recently put down something heavy and was adjusting to the change in his posture. She made tea, because it was what her mother would have done, and they sat at her small kitchen table, the table where she wrote, where she ate, where she'd looked up his name 4 months ago on a restless Sunday. And she asked no questions, and he offered no details, and the tea was hot, and the apartment was small and warm, and the winter was outside doing its January thing, and they were here, inside, which was enough. After a while, he said, "I didn't want you to be involved in this. I know. There's something about keeping you apart from it, even though I know that's complicated by the fact that I'm not apart from it." Yes. She looked at him across the table. He looked back, with all the things he was, all the things she knew about him, and all the things she didn't. The penthouse and the community center and the kitchen arguments about Hemingway and the man who held everything together at 12 years old. "You don't have to keep me apart from it," she said. "I'm not asking to be inside it, Nero. I don't want to know the operational details. I don't want to be part of the decisions. But I'm also not going to pretend it doesn't exist, because it's part of you, and you're—" She stopped, finding the word. "You're part of me now, in the way that things are, when they've changed the landscape." He looked at her with that expression she'd first seen in the study in December. Open, slightly unguarded, the expression of a man receiving something he hadn't believed was coming. "Say it," he said quietly. She looked at him. "I love you." The words in the small kitchen were simple and complete, and she watched them land in his face, the specific way a true thing landed in Nero Falcone, without drama, but with a depth that moved through him like the sound of a bell. "I love you," he said. "I have been—" He paused, in the way that meant full weight was coming. "I have loved you since the night you kept pouring my wine." She laughed, a real laugh, startled out of her by the precision of it, the exactness of the date. "You can't know that," she said. "I can't prove it," he said. "There's a difference." The Marchetti situation, as it turned out, was not concluded. She learned this not from Nero, who had, she believed, genuinely thought it was, but from Luca, who called her on a Monday 3 weeks later with a quality in his voice that told her, before he spoke, that the news was not good. "Dante Marchetti was in the restaurant Saturday night," Luca said. "Marco didn't call Nero. I think Marco made a decision not to worry him, but it wasn't the right decision." "What happened?" "He sat at the bar. He asked Marco about you, when your shifts were, whether you lived alone." A pause. "Marco said he handled it, but Dante left a card, with Marco, for you." She was in the break room at the restaurant, between the lunch and dinner shifts. She sat very still. "What kind of card?" "Just contact information, and a message." "Which was?" Another pause. "That he wanted to make you an offer. That's how he phrased it." She thought about Dante Marchetti, the restless eyes, the practiced charm, the way he'd positioned himself in her path at the party. She thought about the car on Halsted Street in January. She thought about what Nero had said. "He's attempting to demonstrate that I have something that can be reached." "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Nero doesn't know yet. I thought you should know first, so you could decide what to tell him." She understood the gift in that, the choice of order, the small autonomy of being the one to carry the information. "I'll tell him tonight," she said. She told him that evening. She gave him the full account, Luca's call, the card, the message. She watched his face as she spoke. He was very still, not in the way he was usually still, which was a chosen stillness, a composure that was active and maintained. This was different, the stillness of someone holding something back with considerable effort. "All right," he said when she'd finished. "Nero." "I'm all right." "I know you're all right, but I can see that you're also—" "Angry," he said flatly. "I'm angry. I'm angry that he went to the restaurant. I'm angry that Marco didn't call me immediately. I'm angry that—" He stopped. "I'm angry that he thought approaching you was a viable tactic." "Because it is one," she said quietly. "That's why it made him angry. You have something now." He looked at her. "Yes, I have something now." The acknowledgement of it, the simple, undefended admission, was one of the most honest things she'd ever heard him say. She crossed the room to him. "What does it mean for Dante?" she asked. "It means that he's made a statement, and statements like that require responses." His voice was level. "I'm not going to tell you the details of the response." "I know. But I need you to do something for me." "All right. Until this is resolved, until I've had the conversation that needs to be had, I need you to accept Vin. Not everywhere, not all the time, but mornings and nights, the walk to and from the restaurant." She thought about what she'd said in January. "I need you to hear me on this. If someone is with me everywhere I go, I lose something." She thought about the distinction between asking and telling, between choice and accommodation. "Mornings and nights," she said, "and not in the restaurant. Vin waits outside." "Yes, agreed." She looked at him. I trust you to resolve this. I will. I also need you to know, she paused. I understand that these things happen in your world. I understand that they will continue to happen. I'm not asking you to change the fundamental nature of your life. I'm asking you to, she found the right word, include me. Not in the operations, but in the knowledge, in the honesty of it. Always, he said. That night she stayed at the penthouse. She lay beside him in the dark, and the city was far below them, and he was awake, she could tell by his breathing. And she said into the dark, "What are you thinking about?" A long pause. "About how I would prefer this not to be your life. My life is my decision. I know, but preference and acceptance are different things." "What do you prefer?" she asked. "A world in which what I do doesn't carry consequences for people I—" He stopped. "For you. That world doesn't exist." "No, it doesn't." He was quiet. "I've been thinking about other worlds, ones where I'm a different thing, a person who reads books and argues about Hemingway and doesn't have Thursday meetings." She turned to look at him in the dark. "And then I remember that I am who I am, that it's not, I can't perform a different version of myself. This is what I am." A pause. "But the thinking is new. The wanting to be different. I haven't wanted that since I was very young." She reached for his hand in the dark and held it. "Don't be a different thing," she said. "Just be here." He turned his head toward her in the dark. "Here is exactly where I intend to be," he said. She came to know Vin over February and March, the way you came to know people who were present but quiet, slowly, through the accumulation of small details, through the things they chose and didn't choose to say. His full name was Vincenzo Amato. He had been with Nero for 9 years, which predated most of the people in Nero's operational life, and their relationship had the quality of something that had been tested and had held. He was from the West Side, had grown up in circumstances that he described, when she asked directly, as complicated, and had at some point in his early 20s made a connection to the Falcone organization that had proven durable. He drove her to and from the restaurant in the mornings and nights that Nero had stipulated, and in the car he was quiet but present, and she found, over time, that she valued the quality of his company. There was a steadiness to Vin that reminded her of certain kinds of architecture, the solid, load-bearing kind that didn't need ornament. "He's different with you," Vin said, one evening in the car, with the abruptness of someone who'd been holding the sentence for a while and decided to release it. She looked at the side of his face in the rearview mirror. "How so?" "Lighter." He seemed to consider whether to continue, then did. "I've known him 9 years. He's always been," he searched for the word, "efficient. That's the right word. He was very good at doing what needed to be done, and very efficient at everything else." "And now?" "Now he's—" Vin's hands adjusted on the wheel. "He laughs sometimes, not often, but it's there." A pause. "He came in last week and he was angry about something, and then he read a text on his phone, and the anger went somewhere else for a while. That never happened before." She thought about the text she'd sent him that week, something about the novel, a sentence she'd finally gotten right after months of trying, sent at 1 a.m. because she'd been too pleased to wait. She'd sent it without thinking about what it would or wouldn't mean to the recipient. "He's not entirely pleased about it," Vin said. "About being lighter. He doesn't fully trust it." "I know," she said. "He's working on it." Vin was quiet for a moment. "He's a good man," he said. "The good version. The real one." His voice had a particular quality. Not sentimental, not self-conscious. The quality of a statement of fact that had been tested against experience and hadn't changed. "I know," she said again. He nodded, once, and the rest of the drive was quiet, and when he let her off in front of the restaurant, he looked at her briefly in the mirror with an expression that she catalogued as something between approval and relief. Marco, too, changed in small ways over those months. Not dramatically. Marco was a man whose personality had been established by decades of practiced discretion and wouldn't be fundamentally altered by anything short of seismic event. But the particular quality of his caution around her changed. He'd always been careful with her, protective in the way of someone who understood the value of what they had and wanted to preserve it. Now there was something warmer in it, less management, more genuine regard. "You've been good for this place," he told her one night at close, which from Marco was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "I've always tried to be." "I don't mean, yes, the work, but the other thing." He gestured vaguely toward the restaurant, toward the penthouse above and the cars outside, and the whole invisible infrastructure that surrounded the visible one. "It's calmer, less, the tension of certain Thursday nights. It's been different." She thought about this. "You think I've had something to do with that?" "I think Nero has had something to do with it," Marco said carefully. "And I think that's connected to you." She didn't know if that was true. She had no way of seeing the full picture of what Nero's operational world was doing or not doing, and she was careful not to try. But she thought about what Vin had said, about lighter, and she thought about the Pilsen Community Center, and the Syrah painting, and the kitchen in Elmwood Park. And she thought, maybe it was possible that a person could change the temperature of another person's world, even without trying. Maybe that was what love was, at its most structural level. Not the grand declarations or the dramatic gestures, but the slow, persistent alteration of another person's atmosphere, the degree or two of warmth that made some things possible that hadn't been before. She went home that night and opened her laptop and the novel she'd been trying to write for 2 years, and she found that the thing it had been telling her, the story she'd been in the middle of, that she hadn't been ready to hear, was clearer to her now. Not because she understood it better, because she'd lived enough of it to recognize its shape. She wrote 6 pages. They were the best 6 pages she'd written in years. March. Chicago offered spring the way it offered everything else it was ambivalent about. Tentatively, with reversals, with the occasional winter relapse that felt personal. But by mid-March, the lake was moving again, and the trees were considering their options, and the light was doing the thing it did at the spring equinox in northern latitudes, going suddenly longer, the evenings opening up with a generosity that felt earned. The Marchetti situation was resolved. Nero told her this on a Thursday morning, over the phone, with a brevity that indicated the resolution had been unambiguous. She asked no details, and he offered none. She understood that Dante Marchetti had made his statement, and that Nero had responded to it in the language of the world they both occupied, and that the matter was concluded, and that the parameters of her daily life, the Vin arrangement, the careful routes home, were consequently altered. "You can go back to walking the short way," he said. "I'd come to like the long way." A pause. "Fiora." "I'm relieved," she said. "I am. I'm saying that somewhat badly." "You're saying it exactly correctly. It's a thing that's over, and something else will eventually begin, and that's the nature of it." His voice was even. "I need you to know that I did everything I could to—" He stopped. The resolution was surgical. I was careful. She understood what he was trying to tell her, that he had tried to protect her from knowing things that would complicate her, and that the resolution had been of a kind that she could live with, or at least of a kind he could tell her had been as contained as it could be. "I believe you," she said. "I don't need the details." "No, but I needed to say that." "I know. Thank you." Spring brought new registers of each other. They went to New York in April for 4 days, which was the first time they'd traveled together, and which revealed things about each other that Chicago's familiar geography had kept contained. He was a good traveler, organized, undemonstrative about the organizational effort, genuinely curious about places he'd been many times before. He had opinions about which neighborhoods deserved walking and which required cars, and those opinions were generally well-founded, and the 4 days moved through Manhattan with the easy rhythm of 2 people who had learned each other's pace. They went to the Met on their second day. She led, as she had at the Art Institute in Chicago. He followed, in the particular way he followed when he was genuinely attending, not the performative attention of a man being agreeable, but the real attentiveness of a man who decided that the experience of the person beside him was worth studying. In the Egyptian wing, she said, without particularly intending to, "I want to finish the novel." "All right," he said. "I mean, I think I know what it is now, what I've been trying to write. It's about my mother. You were right about that. But it's also about the way the past keeps being present, how you carry people with you even when they're gone, how the dead keep informing the living." She paused. It's not sad, actually. It's more like a record, an account. Of what? Of what was real, of what happened and what mattered. He was quiet for a moment. They were standing before a case of small bronze figures, boats, animals, human forms rendered in the particular simplification that produced great art. "I'd like to read it," he said, "when it's finished." She turned to look at him. "You read? You've seen my bookshelves. You read what you want to read."
That doesn't mean you want to read a first novel by a waitress about grief.
"I want to read anything you write," he said, with the simple, unqualified certainty that he applied to true statements. She looked at him in the Egyptian wing of the Metropolitan Museum, with his dark, precise face and his smoke-colored eyes, and the bones of a man who'd been carrying things for a long time, and had recently, slowly, been learning to put some of them down. "I love you," she said. In front of the bronze boats, in the middle of the afternoon, he reached for her hand. "I love you," he said. They had dinner that night in the West Village with Luca, who happened to be in the city for the same week, and Luca was particularly warm and particularly cheerful, and she suspected he'd arranged to be in New York deliberately, and she liked him very much for it. She moved in with him on a Saturday in April. Not because he asked her to, exactly, or not only because of that. He asked, one evening in late March, with the particular care with which he asked anything that mattered. Would she consider it? Was it something she wanted? Did she understand it wasn't about changing what she was, but about making the logistics of their life together more honest? That last word had been a choice. She'd recognized it. She'd thought about it for 2 weeks. The apartment on Halsted Street was hers in a way that had been important. The small, definite space of a life built through necessity and then maintained through choice. She had made it her own with the particular seriousness of someone who understood that home was something you constructed rather than something you were given. Leaving it felt like a declaration. But then, so did staying. She told her aunt in Philadelphia, who said, "Is he good to you?" "Yes," she said. "Is he safe?" A pause. "He's as safe as he can be. It's complicated." Her aunt, who had known Lucia Esposito for 60 years and had opinions about the men in the Esposito women's lives that were both strong and occasionally accurate, said, "Your mother would have worried." "I know." But she would have wanted to meet him. Fiora sat with that for a moment. "I think she would have liked him." "Why?" "Because he makes decisions and then lives by them. And because he's honest even when it's inconvenient." She paused. "And because he looks at me like I'm the most specific thing he's ever seen." A long silence from Philadelphia. Then her aunt said, "That last one is the important one." The penthouse on a daily basis was different from the penthouse as a visited place. She learned its sounds, the particular way the windows registered wind at different heights, the rhythm of the building's infrastructure, the specific quality of morning light that came off the lake in early April, which was unlike any other light she'd lived with. She arranged her books on a shelf of their own, which he cleared for her without comment, and she put her laptop on the desk in the study, which he also cleared without comment, with only the slightest pause before the photograph of his mother, which she moved to a place where it could still be seen but wouldn't be displaced. He saw her do it and said nothing, but later that night he stood in the doorway of the study, watching her work, and she looked up and found him, with an expression she'd learned to read, the open, unguarded one. "All right?" she said. "More than all right." They made dinner together on weeknights when both their schedules allowed. She cooked with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who'd fed herself and then fed her mother for years, and he was an unexpectedly competent sous chef, not particularly inventive, but precise and attentive in execution. They ate at the kitchen island because the dining table felt formal for 2 people, and they talked about their days with the easy mutual interest of people who had decided that the other person's experience of time was worth knowing about. On the nights when she worked the late shift and he was out, the Thursday nights that continued in their function, if not their specific content, she came home to a light left on, and a note on the kitchen island, written in his precise hand. The notes were small and factual. "Your aunt called. She wants you to call back. There are leftovers." Or, "I moved the book you left on the couch to the desk. The couch is not a bookshelf." She kept the notes in the drawer of the desk, a small accumulation of ordinary evidence of an ordinary life being built in the middle of an extraordinary one. Vin still drove her when Nero wasn't available. Their conversations in the car had developed into a genuine, if irregular, exchange. She'd learned about his wife, his son, his improbable passion for model trains, the collection in the basement of the house in Berwyn that his wife tolerated with the specific, affectionate exasperation of a woman who had long since made her peace with a particular species of obsession. "You've been good for him," Vin said one evening, unprompted, as he had said something similar months ago and now offered it as a different kind of statement, not observation, but conclusion. "He's been good for me too," she said. Vin nodded and didn't say anything else, which was its own kind of confirmation. May. The Tuesday call came at 7 in the morning, which was unusual. She was still in bed, half awake, in the particular comfortable way of people who are deeply asleep when the phone rings, and for a moment before she answered, she was aware of the lake light and of Nero beside her, already awake and reading, which was what he did in the early mornings when he didn't sleep. He handed her the phone before she reached for it, knowing by the number, which she saw was Marco's. Marco called Nero's number first, she knew. That she was receiving the call meant Nero had made a decision. "Marco," she said. Marco's voice was careful in the way that careful voices became when they were managing proximity to something alarming. "I need to tell you something before you come in this morning." "Tell me." "There was a man here last night, after close. He came to the kitchen door, not the front. He asked for you by name." She was fully awake now. She sat up. "What man?" "He said his name was Caruso. He said he had a message for you." Marco paused. "From Dante Marchetti." The name sat in the kitchen of the morning like something cold. Nero, beside her, was very still. "What was the message?" she asked. "He said..." Marco's voice had a quality of reluctance, the reluctance of a man about to pass on something he wished he could contain. "He said that Marchetti wants what was taken from him, that he knows where the person responsible lives." A pause. "He mentioned the penthouse by name." She looked at Nero. His face was controlled in the way that indicated the space directly below the control was not controlled at all. "Thank you, Marco," she said. "Don't do anything. Stay at the restaurant. I'll be in at 11. She ended the call. Nero was already standing, already across the room, already on his own phone, the other one, the one he used for the calls she didn't hear the content of. She sat on the edge of the bed and heard his voice conducting something in low, flat, definitive tones. She didn't try to listen to the specifics. She used the time to be very calm and very clear about what she felt, which was fear, in the specific, manageable way she felt fear, acknowledging it without letting it make decisions. He finished the call. He came back and stood in front of her and looked at her with the expression she recognized as the one that required her full attention. "Tell me," she said. "Dante wasn't as resolved as I thought." His voice was even. He had an arrangement with someone on the inside of... someone who gave him information they shouldn't have given him. About this address. He paused. "I'm handling it today." "How today?" "Directly." He sat beside her on the bed. "I need you to stay here. Not the restaurant today. Vin will be in the building."
Marco said I'd be in at 11.
"Not today." She looked at him. She thought about all the conversations they'd had about choice and autonomy and the particular things she needed from this life. She thought about the cost of that principle, and she thought about the cost of abandoning it, and she found, in the precise calculation of that moment, that she could give him today without losing herself. "Today," she said, "but you call me when it's done." "I will." "Nero?" She put her hand on his face, the gesture she'd developed, her particular gesture with him, palm against his jaw, the specific topography of it. "Be careful. Not because I need you to be, because you need to be." He turned his face into her hand. "I'll be careful," he said. He left at 8. She heard the elevator. She heard the building sounds settling back around his absence, the specific quality of the penthouse without him in it, which she'd learned over April, its very slight emptiness, the way a room changed when a presence left it. She went to the kitchen. made coffee, stood at the window and looked at the lake, which was May blue, which was the specific, vivid blue of Lake Michigan in early May, when the sky above it was clear and the water was finally warm enough to hold the color rather than just reflect it. She made coffee, and she waited, and she was afraid in the manageable way, and she did not allow herself to catastrophize, because catastrophizing was a way of trying to control things that you couldn't control by imagining the worst version of them, which was neither useful nor accurate, and she'd had enough experience of genuine loss to understand the difference between anticipated grief and actual grief. He called at 2:30. "Done," he said. "Are you all right?" "Yes." A pause. "Dante Marchetti has decided to relocate. He and his operation." "Relocate where?" "Somewhere that is not here." A pause. The message was unambiguous. She let out a breath. "Come home," she said. "I'm on my way." He arrived at 3. He looked tired in a way she'd never quite seen on him. Not the tired of sleeplessness, but the tired of expenditure, of having put out a significant amount of something and now requiring the rebuilding of it. His jacket was off, his shirt slightly less perfect than usual, the collar open at the throat. She didn't say anything. She handed him a glass of wine, which she'd opened when he called, and he took it and stood at the window for a moment, looking at the lake. "Are you all right?" she said. Not for the first time, she'd asked on the phone. She asked again because phone calls were one thing, and the physical fact of a person in the room was another. "I will be." "What can I do?" He turned from the window. He looked at her across the room, across the kitchen island and the afternoon light and the small accumulating evidence of their shared life, the books on the shelf and the laptop in the study and the notepad by the coffee maker where they wrote each other messages. And he looked at her with the unguarded expression, the one without the full weight of his composure. "This," he said. "Exactly this." She crossed the room to him. He put his arm around her, and she felt the specific quality of it, the way he held her, which was different from the way he held himself, different from the contained, deliberate use of space he usually practiced. He held her the way a person held something they had been trying not to hold too tightly, and had finally stopped trying. They stood there for a while. The lake was blue through the window, and the city was doing its afternoon business below them, and the apartment was quiet and warm and entirely theirs. "I've been thinking about something," he said, eventually, into her hair. "Tell me." "The nature of this, what it is, what it's going to be." He paused. "I don't want you to be the person who waits at home." She stepped back to look at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, the life we have, the pieces of it, your work, your writing, the way you are in the world." He was choosing words carefully, with the precision that indicated something important. "I don't want any of this to compress that. I don't want you to become—" He paused again. "The woman in the penthouse, the one who waits." She understood. She thought about Carmela Falcone, the woman who had stayed when her husband left, who had raised 2 sons in the weight of everything the Falcone name carried, who had become defined by the shape of the space around a certain kind of man. She thought about what that cost. "Then tell me what you want," she said. "I want you to write your book. I want you to go to the Pilsen Center on Saturdays. I want you to walk places and talk to people and be entirely, completely yourself." He looked at her with complete directness. "I want to be a part of your life. Not, I don't want to be the whole of it." She studied his face. "You understand that this is an unusual thing for a man in your position to say." "Probably." "Most men in your position want—" "I know what most men want." The slight dryness in his voice. "I'm not most men. You said so yourself." She almost smiled. "You're quoting me back at me." "You're worth quoting." A pause. "Fiora, I need you to know that I will do everything I have, everything I am, to protect you. But protection isn't the same as possession. I know the difference. I need you to know that I know it." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was long and golden now, the specific quality of Chicago in late May, when the angle of the sun finally did what it was supposed to do. "I know," she said. "I've always known." She reached up and kissed him, which started with the intention of being simple and became not simple, and they stayed in the penthouse for the rest of the afternoon and evening, and ordered in, and ate at the kitchen island, and she told him about 3 pages of the novel she'd written that morning while she was waiting, and he listened with the full quality of his attention, and that was the evening. That night, lying in the dark beside him, she thought about everything that had happened in the 7 months since the last table on the left, the October night that had changed the shape of things. She thought about Marco saying, "Be careful," and Luca saying, "It's not about you," and Carmela saying, "Be patient with him when he's difficult," and Vin saying, "He's different with you." She thought about the novel. She thought about her mother. She thought about the particular way grief and love occupied the same space in the human heart. Not sequentially, but simultaneously. The way Seurat's dots occupied space, each one requiring the others, the fullness of the image depending on the space between them. She thought, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. She fell asleep to the sound of the city below and his breathing beside her, and the lake doing its deep, patient thing beyond the glass. She finished the novel in July. It happened on a Tuesday, which she hadn't expected. She'd assumed, when it happened, it would feel like a destination she could anticipate, a gradual brightening as she approached. Instead, it simply happened. She was in the study in the morning while Nero was in the city, and she wrote the last paragraph, and then the last sentence, and then the last word, and she sat back, and the screen was there in front of her, and the novel was finished. It was 94,000 words. It was about her mother and about grief, and about the way the people you lost kept living in you, not as ghosts, but as structure, the architecture of your own personality, the load-bearing walls of it. It was also, she understood now that it was done, about the specific difficulty of building something new after a significant loss, the provisional quality of every new attachment, the way you kept testing the ground before you put your weight on it. She called Nero because it was the first call she wanted to make. I finished, she said. A pause. The novel. Yes. Another pause, this one longer, the kind of pause that meant he was feeling something and deciding how to say it. How does it feel? She thought about it. Like setting down something heavy, she said. In a good way. Like setting it down in the right place, not dropping it. Are you pleased with it? I think so. I think it's what it was supposed to be. She paused. I want you to read it, if you still want to. I told you in New York, I want to read anything you write. It's about things that are, she paused, personal. Not about you specifically, but vulnerable things, things I hadn't quite looked at before. I'll be careful with it, he said. She knew he would be. It was one of the things she knew about him with the certainty of accumulated evidence, that he was, in the specific register that mattered, careful. Not cautious. The distinction was important. Caution was about self-protection. Care was about the recognition that what you handled had value, had inherent weight, and required to be held accordingly. He read it over 4 days, in the evenings, in the study. She deliberately didn't watch him reading. She found something uncomfortable about being present for the process, the way you didn't stand over a surgeon. But she was aware of him reading, the light in the study, the particular quality of the apartment when he was deeply in something. On the 5th day, he came to find her in the kitchen, where she was eating breakfast and pretending to read something else. He sat down across from her. He looked at her with the unguarded expression, the open, slightly unresolved look that was the most honest version of him. It's about love, he said. She set down her fork. Is it? Not primarily. The surface of it is about loss. But what it's actually doing, underneath, is making the argument that loss is what love leaves, that grief is the residue of attachment, that you can measure what you loved by what you grieve. He paused. It's a generous argument. Generous how? Because it means nothing is wasted. The grief isn't the opposite of the love. It's the love, continuing. He looked at her steadily. Your mother knew that. I think you've known it for a long time. You just had to write it to see it clearly. She was very still. Something in his face told her he wasn't only talking about the novel. "Nero, I've been thinking about my father," he said, "since reading this, about what I've been carrying, whether I've been treating the grief as the thing I inherited from him rather than," he stopped, "rather than what I could also choose to inherit." "What would you choose?" He was quiet for a moment. "The belief that things can be built correctly, that the work matters, that," he paused in the particular way, "that the people you love deserve to have their lives protected, not managed, not controlled, but that their safety and their flourishing is worth building for." She came around the table to him. He stood and she put her arms around him, which she hadn't done in quite this way, this specific embrace that was about shelter rather than desire, about the simple fact of presence. "Your father would be proud of you," she said. "Not for the work, for this." He was quiet for a long time. She felt his arms tighten. "I hope so," he said. She sent the novel to 3 agents in August. One responded in 6 days. A woman in New York named Priya, who said in a phone call that lasted 45 minutes that she'd read the whole thing in one sitting and couldn't stop thinking about the ending. She told Nero at dinner. His face did the thing it did when she said something that reached him, the small, deep response, invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. "What did it feel like?" he asked, sending it. "Terrifying. Correct." She paused. "Like everything worth doing." September. The restaurant had turned over its menu for the season. The ossobuco remained because some things were permanent. And the light in the evenings had that particular September quality, warm and slightly nostalgic, the quality of something that knew its own brevity and had made peace with it. She was still working the Thursday dinner shift. She'd kept her position at the restaurant through all of it, through the penthouse move and the Marchetti situation and the novel, because it was hers, because she was good at it, because there was something in the specific, honest transaction of service that she found grounding. She'd turned down, twice, Nero's careful, undemanding suggestion that she might not need to work if she didn't want to, because the need hadn't been the point for a long time, and he'd understood that when she'd explained it. Marco had become something like a confidant, in the way of people who shared a specific common knowledge, the way they both knew the dimensions of the thing that occupied the last table on the left, and both chose, in their different registers, to protect it. "The Ricci family is coming in Saturday," Marco told her one Thursday, before service. "Is that significant?" "It's a dinner, to mark the resolution of certain things." He chose his words carefully, as always. "Nero's hosting." She understood. It was the kind of dinner that happened after difficult things concluded, the formal acknowledgement that the landscape had settled. She'd heard him mention the Ricci name months ago, in the context she now understood fully, and the fact of a dinner meant that the alignment had been established, the declarations made. "Will you need me?" she asked. Marco considered. "I'd like you there. Not because of..." He paused. "Because you're the best person on my floor. And because it would mean something to him to have you there." She nodded. Saturday. Saturday. The dinner was different from the Marchetti night in every way that mattered. The same restaurant, the same tablecloths, the same Murano glass candle holders. But the quality of the gathering was different, lighter, more calibrated, the specific tone of a gathering that was about conclusion rather than tension. She worked the room with the ease of 3 years' practice, and the additional ease of someone who now understood its geography in multiple registers. She knew which tables needed closer attention, which conversations were decorative and which were substantive, where the weight of the evening resided. Near the end of service, she was at the service bar when Nero appeared behind the partition, not in the dining room, in the service corridor that ran behind it. He looked at her with a particular expression, one she was still learning. "Come with me," he said. "I'm still..." "Marco has it." She looked at Marco across the room. Marco gave her the slight nod of someone who has agreed to something in advance. She followed Nero through the service door, down the corridor, up the back stairs that she'd never used, to a door she hadn't known was there, which opened onto the restaurant's roof. Chicago in September, from height, was a specific and significant thing. The lake spread out to the east, the city to all other directions, the autumn evening sky doing its slow, tremendous performance in purples and golds. They were alone up there. Someone had, at some point, set up a small table, 2 chairs, a bottle of wine, candles in glass holders against the wind. She looked at all of this, and then at him. Nero. "Sit down," he said. "Please." She sat. He poured the wine. He sat across from her, and for a moment they were just 2 people at a small table on a rooftop in Chicago, with the city below them and the sky above, and everything that had happened since last October in the space between them. "I want to ask you something," he said. "I've been working up to it for a while." "You've been working up to things for a while," she said. "It's one of your qualities." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'm aware." He set down his wine glass. He looked at her with the full quality of his attention, all of it, nothing held back, the complete version of a man who paid attention to everything and was now, in this moment, paying attention to her. "I want to be with you," he said, "not in the way we are, which is good, which is more than I expected to have, but in the full, stated, formal way, the way that makes things unambiguous." He paused. "I want to marry you." The September sky was doing something extraordinary above them, the last of the light hitting the lake at an angle that made the water look like hammered gold. She could hear, very faintly, the restaurant below, the murmur of voices, the sound of a life being lived in the ordinary, real way. She looked at Nero Falcone across the table, the man with the smoke-colored eyes who'd tested her with a bread basket that wasn't cold, who'd left a card without his name on it, who'd taken her to an art center in Pilsen, and a Seurat painting, and his mother's kitchen, and told her the truth, even when it was inconvenient. The man who'd asked Vin to be 14 minutes away, and who'd left a light on, and who'd read her novel with the specific care of someone who understood that what they were handling had value. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table. She took his hand. Below them, Chicago conducted itself with its usual magnificent indifference to the private histories being made within it, and the lake was gold, and the candles in their glass holders held against the wind. "That's it?" he said. "Yes?" "You spent 7 months earning a yes," she said. "It doesn't need to be complicated." He looked at her. Then he laughed, a real laugh, full and genuine, the kind Luca had described from years ago, the kind that had been largely absent until recently. It transformed his face into something she loved, and she knew she would keep loving it, through all the Thursdays still to come, and the difficult Januaries, and the ordinary Tuesdays and the extraordinary ones, the long, complicated life of 2 particular people who had found each other in the specific way that mattered. "No," he said, "I suppose it doesn't." A year. 1 year since a Thursday in October when the restaurant smelled like garlic and old money, and a man with smoke-colored eyes watched a waitress pour wine as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. She still worked Thursday nights. She decided to keep the shift even after the wedding, which had been small, in November, in Carmela's house in Elmwood Park, with Luca and Elena and the children, and Marco and Vin and her aunt from Philadelphia, who cried through the entire ceremony with the enthusiastic commitment of a woman who had been waiting for something to cry happily about. Because the Thursday nights were where it had started, and because she was still, on some fundamental level, the person who poured wine and carried bread and understood the room by its sounds. The novel had sold in October. Priya had called with the news in the first week, almost exactly a year to the day from the night that had started everything, a timing that Fiora found too pointed to be accidental and too true to dismiss. It would be published the following spring. She was working on something new, which was different in every particular from the first, and yet recognizably built by the same person. On the Thursday that marked exactly 1 year, she was setting up her section before service when she heard the sound she still recognized, the particular change in the restaurant's atmosphere that preceded a certain kind of arrival. The candles near the front door rippled. She looked up. He came in the way he always came in, contained, precise, with the gravitational quality that organized the room around him. He was alone tonight. No Thursday meeting, no men with still shoulders. Just him, in a dark jacket, looking at her across the restaurant with an expression she'd been cataloging for a year, and still found new things in.
He sat at the last table on the left.
She finished what she was doing. She prepared the tray. Water, still. The Barolo, because some things were permanent. Bread, warm, because that joke had become a private language. She walked across the restaurant with the easy competence of someone who knew this room the way she knew her own face. And she set the glasses and the wine and the bread with the slight theatrical tilt of the pour that she'd never stopped doing because it felt true to the version of herself who had stood here the first time and decided to keep pouring. He watched her through all of it. When she set down the bread basket, she met his eyes. The same smoke-colored eyes that had watched her a year ago with the deliberate, assessing surveillance of a man encountering something that didn't fit his categories. Tonight they held something that had nothing to do with assessment. "The bread," he said. She looked at the basket. She looked at him. "It's warm," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." She put her hand over his on the tablecloth, her particular gesture, the one that was theirs, the way certain gestures belong to certain people by long right of use. The restaurant was filling behind them, the Thursday evening finding its rhythm, the city doing its thing outside the windows where the October wind was pressing its cold persuasion against the glass. "What would you like tonight?" she asked. He turned his hand under hers so they were palm to palm. He looked at her with the full quality of his attention, the complete version, nothing held back, and in the candlelight of the last table on the left, in the restaurant that had been the beginning of everything, he said, "What I've always wanted. Exactly what I have." She married him in November. The novel came out in April. By that summer, a year and a half after A Thursday in October, she was finishing the second book, and he was managing the kind of world he'd always managed, with the difference that there was a light left on when he came home, and a woman at the kitchen island who asked about his day and meant it. Luca's children called her Zia Fiora by spring. Carmela taught her to make the specific version of ragu that had been in the Falcone family for 3 generations. Marco retired in June, and she wept at his going-away dinner in a way that surprised no one who knew her and no one who knew him. Vin drove them to the airport in September for their delayed honeymoon, Florence and then the coast south of Naples, where she stood on the same hillside that was in the photograph on the study desk, and understood, in the specific way you understood things when they became physical and real, why a man who lived in Chicago kept a photograph of this particular light on his desk. She wrote about it later, not in the novel, but in the private record she'd been keeping since April of the previous year, the document she'd started the night after the first dinner, the one that was neither fiction nor journal, but something between the two, the form that she suspected was what she'd really been trying to write all along. She wrote, "Here is what I know. The distance between things is what makes the image possible. You can measure what you loved by what you grieve. Loss is what love leaves behind, still living in you, still building the walls that hold you up. And sometimes, in a restaurant in Chicago on a Thursday in October, when the candles ripple and the room holds its breath, and a man with smoke-colored eyes decides to test you with a bread basket, the distance closes, the dots touch, and instead of going flat, the colors become something you didn't know was possible. Something real. Something that holds." She closed the document. The apartment was quiet in the late afternoon. The penthouse above the city, the lake blue gold through the windows, the specific sound of a life being lived in it. She heard the elevator. She heard his footsteps on the entry floor, the particular rhythm of them, the way she knew them by now, the way she knew this building by its sounds. Fiora, his voice, carrying through the apartment with the easy certainty of a man who knew where he was going. "In here," she said. He came to the doorway of the study and stood there, looking at her the way he'd looked at her in the doorway the first time, in December, when she'd moved the photograph. Unguarded, slightly open, the expression that was the truest version of him. "How's the book?" he said. "Good today," she stretched. "Come see." He crossed the room and stood behind her chair and read the paragraph on the screen. She watched his face as he read, the small, real response, the thing that moved behind his eyes when something was true. He put his hands on her shoulders. "Good," he said simply. Outside, the lake was gold, and the city was doing its perpetual, magnificent thing, indifferent and enormous, the whole great complicated fact of it going on. Below them, somewhere on a street in the near north side, a restaurant was filling for dinner, the candles burning in their Murano glass holders, the last table on the left, waiting as it always waited, dressed in its white linen, like a possibility that hadn't yet been named. The wind came off the lake, the candles held.